life after spending the Buonapartes. By Anders Fager. I under the bridge at Arcali. It felt like being kicked in the groin. He fell forward, dropped the collar and his sword. The din and thunder of the world faded. The last thing he saw was Colonel Murian. He lay on his back, some distance away on the river bank. Blood trickled out of his mouth. This is not going well, thought Napoleon Bonaparte, commander of the Republic's army of Italy. Then all went dark. Napoleon Bonaparte didn't remember hitting the ground. Didn't remember the bodies falling on top of him. They must have rolled down the ravine together. He and whoever they were. The water was cold. That's what woke him up. That and the pain in his gut. He tried to crawl, but couldn't move his legs. Napoleon Bonaparte resigned himself to his fate. Didn't bother opening his eyes. He was as good as dead. That much he knew. A shot in the gut and paralysis, there was nothing to be done. How miserable. He had just turned 27. He had been married, an army commander, for 8 months. He had only gotten 8 lousy months to make his mark on history. It felt petty. The pain in his stomach wasn't too bad. Yet. It would get worse soon. When the shock wore off. He had seen men live for days after a shot in the gut. In horrible pain. It dawned on him, in a haze, that no one had come for him. That meant his army was losing. General Augereau's troops must have been completely routed. Such rabble. Augereau and his bandits. You lead them to all the world's glory? Let them sack Lombardy. And they cannot even drag you to the surgeon. How miserably petty. He thought of Caesar. Caesar, who always wore a red mantle on the battlefield. Who always threw himself into battle where his men wavered. And the legionnaires who saw his red mantle knew that Caesar was with them. That he saw their courage and shared their fate. Napoleon Bonaparte had read the old texts so many times. In his room at Brienne. 14 years old and cheeks flushed with excitement. Even then he wanted to be like Caesar. And he had heard it time and time again. If you want to be like Caesar, act like Caesar. When he got the chance, he really tried. He had been bold and resolute. Taken risks on the front line. Seen the bravery of his men and shared their fate. They had cheered at his bravado. And now he was lying by a creek in a ravine, waiting to die. It wasn't even a glorious death. Just a gloomy end to a gloomy week. Uninspiring misery in the cold and rain. The Austrians' third attempt to retake Mantua had started out just the same as the first two. They had come slogging again, but this time, everything had gone their way. Field Marshal Alvinci de Bourbourec, sickly and ancient, had beaten Napoleon Bonaparte. Twice. Napoleon Bonaparte, who in a few months had conquered Piedmont and Milan. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had brought the Pope to his knees and won 24 battles, had been beaten back at Bassano and Caldiero. It was embarrassing. Now only Verona stood in the way of Alvinci becoming the savior of Mantua. And Napoleon Bonaparte lay bleeding in a ravine. He thought of his mother. And coughed. One of the bodies on top of him twitched. In the distance, he heard shouts. Muskets. Were they yelling orders in German or French? No matter. Soon the pain would really come. Would he call for mother then? Severe, composed Letizia Bonaparte, who refused to speak French. What would she do after he died? Would she stay in Marseilles? Who would take care of her? His younger siblings. Luigi, who served in his headquarters. Angry Elisa, his eldest sister? Paola. 12-year-old Girolamo? Little Carolina, who fell in love every time she met a man in uniform? The last time it had been the charming Major Murat. Big brother Giuseppe and little brother Lucien? They were in France, in love with Paris and politics. Napoleon Bonaparte coughed. It hurt like hell. His thoughts drifted back to his big brother. Giuseppe Bonaparte, who had married Julie Clary, Desiree Clary's older sister. Desiree had been engaged to him. General Bonaparte. He almost laughed, despite the pain. That would have been something, him marrying Desiree at the same time as Giuseppe married her sister. How very Corsican. Mother would have liked it. If you can name 4 newborn baby girls Marie Anne, you have to be wonderfully stubborn. The 4th had lived. They called her Elisa now. As if she had outgrown being Marie Anne, who soon will die. She was 18, testy and stubborn. Far too much like her mother. Rural, snappy, and unsophisticated. And she hated Josephine just as much as mother did. Perhaps because she would never get a man of the same caliber as her big brother. Because she had to settle for Captain Bacciocchi. A captain. Of decent Corsican ancestry. Nobility with goats and herdsmen in the pedigree. How wretchedly petty. It felt like a wolf was tearing at his guts. Soon he would start to scream. He thought of Josephine again. Of their passion. Of her body. The thought made him smile. Even lying in a ravine underneath some grenadiers. Josephine. After the wedding they had had 2 days together before he went to join the army of Italy. He had written to her almost every day. Wise, beautiful Josephine. She was all Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to be. Urbane, sophisticated, erotic, exotic. He loved her company. Her world. The doors opened by her many friends and old lovers. He should thank Barras. Member of the Directory and responsible for matters of internal security. It was this horny idiot who had paired up the young general with his discarded mistress. It was Scabras, but now Napoleon Bonaparte was one of them. And Barras and Carnot and the others in the Directory depended on him. When he saved them from the riots on the 13th of Vendemiaire, they gave him the army of Italy. And he had married Josephine. Barras never got to do that. Josephine had laughed when he changed the spelling of his name and got rid of the provincial Bonaparte. She had called him vain. It was the first time he had ever been angry at her. Napoleon Bonaparte hated it when people made jokes at his expense. He had always hated it. He hated everything that didn't go his way. Everything. After the setback at Caldiero, they held council in Verona. General Messina proposed another attack and General Auguero as usual had no opinion at all. The 2 best divisional commanders in the world. Men Caesar would have been proud to lead. An old smuggler and a former dancing teacher and deserter. They were confident. Hardened, experienced men, hungry for money and glory. Napoleon decided on a flanking maneuver. Messina listened absent-mindedly and immediately understood the plan. To Auguero, one had to explain like a schoolmaster. We are here on the map. They are there. While Alvinci is busy at Verona, we move east. Here. In behind him. We cross the Adige here and Messina moves north. Behind Alvinci. You, Auguero, march to the Alpone, the next river. Further in behind him. If you cross the Alpone you can cut off Alvinci's supply lines, and he'll be doomed. It was a mediocre plan. Bold, if it made Alvinci nervous about what they were doing behind his back. Idiotic, if Alvinci didn't care about them at all and advanced on Mantua. At first, all went according to plan. They crossed the Adige and Messina marched north through the bogs. Then Auguero reached the Alpone. At a village called Arcoli. That's where everything went wrong. The weather was miserable. The Alpone was a ravine. The bridge was 30 yards long and crumbling. Arcoli was full of stubborn Croats with a couple of cannons. As if that wasn't enough, Auguero had had a lousy day. His brigadiers too. Both Lons and Verdier had been wounded in vain, no one could find a ford and Auguero's grenadiers were hiding in ditches. Napoleon Bonaparte had scolded Auguero, looked down on him despite being the shorter man. And Augereau had done what he did best, led a charge across the bridge. He was followed by a few dozen men from Bon's brigade. The Croats gunned down every single man except Augereau, who was left standing alone on the middle of the bridge. He stood there, tall and majestic, and made no attempts to run or seek cover. He danced a few steps and saluted the Croats. Then he turned and walked back. Not a shot was fired after him. Both the Croats and his own men cheered. Napoleon Bonaparte saw the whole thing and hated it. Stupid antics. He sat hunkered down behind the embankment for a long while. Heard Augereau's voice in the distance. Guns firing from both sides of the creek. Little brother Luigi chattering away with the other adjutants. Nothing happened. No one was taking charge. He thought of Caesar. If you want to be like Caesar, act like Caesar. A color, he had heard himself shout. Get me a color. Let's show them how it's done. Luigi, Marmont, and the others had stared at him. Murian rose and called for a color. A color, damn it. A sound, like the beating of a carpet, then Jean-Baptiste Murian fell forward across the embankment. A lieutenant called out, waving a color. They ran toward him, heads down. Slipped in the mud and crawled on hands and knees along the embankment. All those studies. All that knowledge. All those years in school among spoiled brats. All that hard work at the topographic bureau. All that groveling to Barras and Carnot. All that work for the directory. This is where one ends up. In the mud. Far from any glory. Behind an earth wall in the middle of nowhere. Ogled by a pack of grenadiers. Are you the victors from Lodi? He had yelled. They stared at him. Remembered the day when he had led them across another bridge. In a meaningless charge against a fleeing enemy. That was the day when he had won their hearts. Became our little corporal and Bonaparte with a proper French spelling. Follow me, grenadiers. Some of them got to their feet, still crouching. Grabbed their muskets. He saw more and more of them tense up. They got that look in their eyes. The will to conquer. The hunger for glory. Caesar saw them. It was time. He drew his sword. Napoleon Bonaparte roared forwards, and took a few steps up the embankment. He heard the men cheer. Heard them call out his name. Josephine should see him now. Mother should see him. Caesar should see him. He took a few more steps. Heard the men rise. They were with him. They chanted about him, about the Republic and, we are the winners from Lodi. Forwards. Forwards. He posed like he had practiced so many times. When he was Caesar. 14 years old in his room at Brienne. With the color in his left hand, resting in the bend of his arm. His sword pointed toward the enemy. The Croats over there. Let's run them off. He took one step. One more step. And was shot. It was miserably petty. To the son of Belfiore. Late in the afternoon, General of Division Messina got word that Bonaparte had fallen, and assumed command over the army of Italy. He asked for Bonaparte's body. Augereau snapped that he had forgotten it. He had been busy getting his damn division in order and getting the wretches across the creek. He didn't have time to look for the damn little general who had given the damn order to cross the damn creek. Surely Berthier and all other little adjutants must be good for something. Augereau had not realized that two of the little adjutants had fallen trying to retrieve the general's body. Bonaparte's little brother Lieutenant Luigi Bonaparte and Major Auguste Marmont both lay in the mud under the bridge. 18 and 22 years old. Along with the soldiers who had followed them over the embankment. Men who would soon be forgotten. He woke up at dusk. There was no shooting. Only shouts some distance away. The pain in his stomach came and went. He should let go. But he wanted to know. Would the two pompous fools of generals be capable of carrying out his plan? It wasn't that brilliant. But it would work. If they only stuck to it. Would they? Did they understand that the whole plan hinged on pressing on so stubbornly that Alvinci was forced to react? Because no general in his right mind would attack through the marches at Arcoli if he didn't have a grand plan. That's what we must make Alvinci believe. That we are doing something clever. You cannot stop attacking. His stomach turned into a fire of pain. Napoleon Bonaparte's mind drifted. Josephine. Mother. All the brothers and sisters he had planned to take care of. What would they say about him in Paris? Would Luigi tell the story of his last battle to the Directory? Would they be moved to tears, say that the flame that burns half as long burns twice as bright? That sounded good. Some flames burn like a fire in the stomach. The pain was terrible now. Someone should come by and shoot him. And would Messina be up to it? Would he carry out the plan and make it seem so obvious that only Messina could? The spoiled child of victory, to whom everything came naturally. Had Messina only bothered to read a book every now and then, he could have been the one to lead the army of Italy. But he was only interested in women and money. Neither housemaids nor countesses were safe from him. Neither monasteries nor churches. Napoleon Bonaparte never got to hear about the triumph. On November 15 at Belfiore, 5 miles from where he lay bleeding to death, Messina had torn apart 3 Austrian brigades that had been set against him. He crushed them one by one and kept his position in the little village. When the night fell, the Croats at Arcoli searched the Alpones ravine for wounded troops. They found the dying general and dragged him out. By the time they had found a medic, he was already dead. It would take a few days before his body was returned to his army. The bodies of his little brother and his adjutant no one cared about. They were thrown into a mass grave together with everyone else who had fallen at the bridge that day. If only they would remember whose plan it was. He thought of mother again. Of Josephine naked. Now she was a widow again. He hoped she would inherit what he had sent home. And that Barras would take care of her. And that his brothers and sisters would get along without him. And mother. He succumbed to the pain. Mother, Messina, and Josephine. Deep down, into the abyss. In a ditch at Arcoli. It was a lousy death in a lousy place. Messina's division spent the night at Belfiore. Slept in battle order. 10 miles away, Alvinci tried to decide what to do. Marching on Mantua was out of the question as long as the French in Belfiore threatened his rear. Should he destroy them and then march on Mantua? Late in the night he made his decision. The deciding factor was the French setback at Arcoli and the news that the young General Bonaparte had fallen. The more of his generals he spoke to, the more confident Alvinci became. The French were in disarray and Messina's men at Belfiore were covering the retreat. An Italian Jew disguised as a general stood between him and victory. Now he would teach the little rascal a lesson. Alvinci ordered his brigades to march on Belfiore at dawn. The French would be hunted like dogs. Messina had a sleepless night. Later, in his court in Milan, he would tell his retinue about those hours before dawn. How he had eaten for the first time in over a day and how he had dried his socks. How he had lain down for a while on a cart, but wasn't left in peace. The chief of staff Berthier needed his attention. Augureau wanted to know what to do. Vauboy and Macward reported from afar. The questions never ended. He had to get used to it. He was the commander now. Commander of the army of Italy. And he wasn't about to give up that position. It would take months for the Directory to find a replacement for Bonaparte. And who would they send? Moreau and Jordan were fighting in Germany, and Hockey was busy with an expedition to Ireland. Surely they couldn't call on Schurer or some of the other old fossils who Messina had endured during the years. Perhaps they would force Kleber back into active duty? Or Pichegru? Or they would finally realize ability was more important than having shared a mistress with Barras or being Carnot's obedient servant. Granted, Bonaparte was talented, but he was a kid. Grumpy and not even 30. Peace be with him. A lousy death in a lousy place. Messina made up his mind, lying there on the cart. With Berthier at his side, he would be as successful as Bonaparte. He had spoiled the Directory with victories, and Messina would continue to do so. Carnot would be so busy reading victory reports that he wouldn't have time to replace him. And Messina would continue to send money. He would grease Paris like no other. Italy was rich. It was enough for both himself and the Directory. The sun rose a little after 7. In Belfiore, drums thundered and men fell in line. Messina's troops were starving and freezing like dogs. He rode among them. Encouraged them, scolded them. Explained, again and again, that Bonaparte had fallen and that they would now avenge him. The cheers were tired. By 8, Messina got word from Augereau. He was on his way. Messina set his division in motion. It was a triumphant day. The sun broke forth at 9 and later people would talk of how the sun at Belfiore shone that day, when the war against the coalition was won. Alvinci's brigades came chasing stragglers but ran into two of the best divisions in the world that were not retreating a bit. Messina and Augereau tore the Austrian units apart wherever they met them. Late at night, when the sun had already set, Messina took Villanova and cut the Austrian army in half. Alvinci and his officers were chased through the city by French hussars. The night was an orgy of wine and food, when the Austrian stores were plundered. Messina rode around in his division and saluted men who had distinguished themselves. The triumph was complete. The next day Messina sent Dumas' cavalry to hunt down the remains of Alvinci's forces. The Black Devil chased the Austrians to Vicenza and captured Alvinci himself. Augereau cleared the way to Verona and pushed some Austrians into the already overcrowded Mantua. Almost 8,000 prisoners were rounded up outside Villanova. Messina sent word to Paris that the young Bonaparte had fallen but that he, André Messina, had taken charge of the situation and won a great victory. Alvinci was captured and his army routed. The message of victory was delivered by Rampon and Murat, who brought with them some coffins laden with silver and a carriage full of conquered colors. On the 22nd of November 1796, Messina defeated the last remaining Austrian forces in Italy. In a blizzard he attacked Davidovic's divisions at Rivoli, and when darkness fell another 2,000 Austrian prisoners were marched south. There were now no Austrians between Messina and the Tyrol, and along the way to Vienna only a few thousand men remained. The army of Italy could at any time wipe them out and cross the Carinthian Alps. There was near panic in Vienna. 3 weeks later Mantua surrendered and another 22,000 Austrians were taken prisoner. Messina sent carriage after carriage laden with guns and colors to Paris, where the Directory argued over who would replace Bonaparte. Barras thought Messina was not to be trusted. He was too devious, and Italian. A dog of war, to be kept on a short leash. Murat and Rampon made sure the arguments took time. Financed demonstrations and held court. It was wretchedly petty. Meanwhile, they celebrated young Bonaparte's memory. His body was brought to Marseilles by ox cart. His mother took his coffin to Corsica and buried him in Ajaccio. His little brother got a tombstone next to him. It was said her heart was broken by losing 2 sons in one day, and that she considered joining a convent. She never left Corsica again. She died in 1806. 3. A family of the Republic. Letizia Bonaparte's youngest daughter, Carolina, followed her mother to Corsica but left her 6 months later to join Joachim Murat in Paris. Carolina and Joachim got a few months together before Messina broke with the Directory and Barras ordered every disloyal officer to be arrested. But while Rampon was imprisoned and guillotined, Murat and his Carolina managed to escape. After many adventures they ended up in Cadiz, where they were married. The next few years Murat served in the Spanish army, before the couple moved to Naples and then on to Constantinople. In 1807 they came to the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, where officers were recruited to the army the King of Spain was sending to the Louisiana War. A year later the couple arrived in New Orleans, in the company of their 3 children and 3,000 horsemen. They spent 4 years taking part in the slow war between Spain and the United States before Joaquin Murat fell in battle near Birmingham, Alabama. Even today he is considered a freedom fighter in the Spanish parts of North America, and the capital of the Republic of Texas is named after him. Carolina Murat stayed in Louisiana until 1819, when she moved to London with an English cotton trader. For the rest of her life she would deeply resent all countries with presidents. Napoleon Bonaparte's brothers and sisters managed fine without him. His older brother Giuseppe stayed in Paris, eventually changing his name to Joseph and started spelling his family name like his little brother had. He was a member of the Council of Elders through the Civil War and the War of 1803, serving the Republic and 6 presidents, both as minister and as envoy to the United States and Austria. During Tsar Alexander's War in 1826 his skillful diplomacy helped avoid a great European war and united Prussia, Austria, and France in the European Central Pact that came to play such a big role during the latter part of the 19th century. He retired after the imperial elections of 1832. He had 2 daughters with the older sister of his little brother's fiancée. Both were to name their sons after their dead uncle, the general. While the Directory spent the new year of 1797 arguing, Massena sent an olive branch to Vienna. Had they not fought enough? Archduke Charles had managed to hold off Moro and Jordan on the Rhine, but soon the threat to Vienna would force him to retreat toward Bavaria and the Tyrol. His army would face 3 French ones when spring came. Shouldn't they rather talk? The young general's younger brother Lucien Bonaparte also remained in the politics of Paris. He was one of those in favor of giving the Italian command to Hoche. The young, handsome Hoche, who had beaten down royalist rebellions and just come back from an expedition to Ireland, was the people's choice. But the men in the Directory were suspicious of him, and Massena's agents Rampon and Murat obstructed all attempts to come to a decision. At the end of January 1797 Archduke Charles and Massena met in Trent to discuss a truce. Massena spoke for France without actually having the mandate to do so, but army commanders Jordan and Moro had secretly let both him and the Archduke know that they supported the negotiations. It had been a long war and both France and Austria were weary. Austria's brother-in-arms Britain was kept out of the talks, a fact that would distance Austria from the British and set the stage for the Central Pact 30 years later. In many ways, the idea of the Central Pact was born there in Trent. In a meeting between an emperor's resolute little brother and 3 self-indulgent French generals. On the 1st of March 1797, Archduke Charles and Massena signed the truce, which stipulated that the parties should meet for proper peace negotiations in Bolzano 2 months later. Massena presented the Directory with a fait accompli. A peace with the arch-enemy and the coalition against France was no more. The Directory, that had just agreed to replace Massena with old Kellerman, was left with a peace it never asked for. It was Massena the traitor's great political moment. And the only one. For the Directory the peace was a disaster. The almost bankrupt state lived off the spoils from Italy, and in May, Massena cut off the flow of silver. At the same time, he called his generals to a meeting in Mantua. For once, he had read a book about Caesar. A passage about casting a die had made a great impression on him, and he had spoken to the rulers of the North Italian city-states: Piedmont, Milan, Venice. The idea of a union was discussed. A union that evolved the Transpadane Republic that Bonaparte had founded. Barras and old Kellerman went to Italy to sort out the situation. When Barras met Massena in Milan he had already cast his die, and he was arrogant. Why should the most feared legions in Europe, led by Europe's best general, bow to a bumbler like Barras? Especially when he had the Pope, the Doge of Genoa and the King of Sardinia on his side. Josephine never got to see her husband's remains and never visited his grave. She was busy saving what she could of the inheritance she was entitled to. And in the spring of 1797 she fell for another handsome officer, the general of brigade Bernadotte, who Jordan had sent to Paris to defend the interests of the Rhine armies. But Bernadotte, who would become a leading figure of French 19th-century politics, wasn't interested. Some say Napoleon Bonaparte's little sister Elisa spread malicious rumors about Josephine. Others say Elisa herself seduced Bernadotte to keep him busy. In Milan, Barras and Messina couldn't agree on a single point and the atmosphere was hostile. Kellerman declared that he was uninterested in politics and left them both to argue, and went home to retire. Barras too soon left Milan, and Berthier, Kilman, and some other lower officers decided to follow him. At the city gates of Milan, stones and rotten vegetables were thrown after them. The army of Italy split in two. Some battalions marched on Milan, others on Nice. There were rumors of mutiny in the army of the Alps. That it too was siding with Messina. That Barras had been killed. That British troops had landed in Genoa to support Messina. So far, there was no open fighting. But it was in the air. On the 6th of June, Messina formally took power in the Transpadane Republic and declared his right to the Iron Crown of Lombardy. The schism with the Directory was complete and Barras sentenced Messina to death in his absence. Spurned by her husband's family and penniless, Josephine went to Italy to seek help from her husband's allies. She lived through the civil war at the court in Milan and then went into exile with Messina. First in Rome and then in Naples. After Messina's murder in 1802 she moved to Spanish New Orleans, which had become a popular haunt for exiled French nobility. She died a pauper in 1810. It is said that she, on her deathbed, laughed at the news that Bernadotte had been elected the third president of France. Her nemesis Elisa Bonaparte Bacciocchi remained in Paris for some years before moving with her husband to Marseilles, exporting wines. She had 8 children, and it is unclear how many of them her husband had fathered. The Bacciocchi family is to this day one of France's leading wine exporters. And still the Elisa grape is said to rouse the passion of married women. In Paris, Lucien Bonaparte supported making Hockey dictator until the war is over, but after the Civil War he was one of the first to warn that the Republic's savior could easily become its next enemy. Lucien hated how all attempts to fight oppression led to more oppression. When the murder of Messina could be traced to circles close to Hockey, Lucien resigned from all offices and moved to Georgia with his 2 young daughters and a maid. Not even when his older brother Joseph, Barras, and Bernadotte forced Hockey to resign, he came back home. He lived for a time in Savannah, engaged in the struggle to free the Louisiana Territory from Spanish oppression. After the war the family moved to New York, where Lucien worked as a lawyer and a teacher. He died in 1836 without ever considering changing the spelling of his family name. In 1861, his granddaughter Elise became the first female doctor in America. When Barras reached Nice at the end of May 1797, he gave the command of the newly formed Army of the Riviera to Berthier. He immediately set to work to make sure Messina wouldn't cross the Alps. Fririn, the proconsul in Marseilles, helped Berthier. They ruled with an iron fist and quashed all attempts to join Messina. The coastal fortifications remained French. The mountain passes to Piedmont did too. It would take months for the Directory to gather an army around Nice, but France was secure. The rebellion would not spread. In all this, it was an ironic twist of fate that Fririn had just been engaged to marry Napoleon Bonaparte's little sister Paula Bonaparte. She was 28 years younger than Fririn, beautiful and pleasure-loving. In the fall of 1797, a year after her older brother's death, she married the man who by then was known as the Butcher of the Riviera. It was said that she enjoyed watching him work. The Civil War, as it came to be called despite actually being a war between Messina's Lombardic Republic with the support of Spain and Britain on one side and France supported by Austria on the other, had reached a critical stage. Set upon by 4 armies, Messina tried to protect his union, but his Italian allies deserted him and his French elites grew doubtful. To whore and pillage one's way through Italy was one thing, to die for Italy was quite another. Messina deserted the council he had formed in Milan and left it to Don Giovanni, a bombastic nobleman from Milan who had become his chancellor. It was a grand drama. Messina and his retinue avoided combat and tried to negotiate. Negotiation had always been Messina's weakness. He should have fought. Too late he realized only General Messina could save King Andrew. At Alessandria, Auguero deserted him on the battlefield and let his men, cheering, go to the forces of Archduke Charles and General Moro. At Moro's headquarters Auguero was cut down by a hussar colonel by the name of Michel Ney. The Battle of Alessandria was over before it had even started, and at dusk Messina fled south with a few followers, mistresses, and servants. Frieren died in 1829 after a long career in the Republic's Security Committee. It was said that his dead enemies could be heard uttering a collective sigh of relief when he died. Paola Bonaparte survived her greedy husband by only 2 years. She died in a fire at the old harbor of Marseilles. It was said the ghost of Hoki had found her. Hoki, who had been forced by her husband to confess his plans to declare himself emperor. The last of the young general's siblings was Girolamo Bonaparte. He turned 12 on the same day that his older brother fell at Arcole. He stayed in France under the protection of Frieren and Paola, and studied to become a naval officer. Lieutenant Jerome Bonaparte served on board the frigate Uranie in the War of 1803, and distinguished himself in the Battle of Cadiz. In 1807 he became the youngest captain ever in the Navy, when he at age 23 took command of the frigate Hortense. He distinguished himself again during the Louisiana Wars and led a French-American frigate squadron. He was seriously wounded at the Keys, but continued leading his squadron. In 1816 he was named vice admiral and became the ambassador to Washington. As one of those who had saved the United States from a blockade during the Louisiana Wars, Jerome was incredibly popular in the country. When it became known that the charming Frenchman was a bachelor, he was inundated by letters from brash American women. He was married in 1818 to the beautiful widow Elizabeth Patterson Franklin, and the couple became the center of Washington high society. During Tsar Alexander's War, Jerome returned to France for a while and led the French-Prussian Navy in the Baltic Sea. After the war he worked for a few years with the development of the joint Central European Navy, before leaving Europe for his love in Washington. Jerome's final deed in Europe was to make sure the Navy's new and advanced steam frigate was named Napoleon Bonaparte after his brother. The promising young general who fell in battle on the same day that the traitor Messina triumphed at Belfiore. In actual history, the Battle of Arcole was fought between the 15 and 17 of November 1796, during the Third Austrian attempt to raise the French siege of Mantua. The battle consisted of 3 days of repeated French attacks against the Austrian position at Arcole. The attacks were carried out with none of the usual French finesse or skill, but were determined enough to get across and make the Austrian commander Alvinci take notice and stop his advance on Mantua. After the battle Alvinci lost heart and retreated, despite having lost less troops than the French. There have been several spectacular paintings made of Napoleon's dash across the bridge at Arcole. Napoleon's aide Murat gets shot in most of the paintings, and that is about the only true part in them. In real life Napoleon seemed to have gotten up a bit away from the bridge to wave his men on, and then either slipped and fell into a ditch or got knocked over by Murat, who got shot seconds later. About Anders Fager. Anders Fager is aging well while living in Stockholm. He writes mostly horror and has to this day written 2 novels and 3 collections of short stories, all set in a contemporary Lovecraftian universe. He has so far been published in Swedish, French, and Finnish, and the short story you have just read is his first try at historical fiction as well as his first published short story in English. The fall of 2014 will see him writing a play called The Queen in Yellow for a major Swedish theater.